Saipan, July 1944. The air was thick with smoke and death. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians were trapped in caves and bunkers across the island, indoctrinated by their military code to choose death over the dishonor of surrender. The Bushido code was absolute. Die for the emperor, never yield to the enemy. American commanders knew that taking the island would mean a bloodbath, cave by cave, bunker by bunker, until every last defender was killed. But on this morning, something impossible was about to happen. A lone figure emerged from the tree line, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, just 18 years old, armed with nothing but a rifle, broken Japanese, and audacity that bordered on insanity. Private Guy Gabaldon was about to walk into enemy territory and do what military strategists said couldn't be done. He was going to convince soldiers who had been trained since childhood to die rather than surrender, to lay down their arms and walk into captivity. And he wasn't going to bring back a handful of prisoners. He was going to bring back 800. This is the true story of how a street-smart kid from East Los Angeles, who'd never graduated high school, who'd learned Japanese from a foster family in California, pulled off the largest single-handed capture of enemy combatants in American military history. It's a story of impossible courage, psychological warfare, and one teenager's refusal to accept that mass suicide was inevitable. Guy Gabaldon grew up hard. Born in 1926 to Mexican-American parents in Los Angeles, he spent his childhood shining shoes on street corners and running errands to help his family survive the Depression. The streets of East LA were his classroom, and survival was his education. He learned to read people, to hustle, to talk his way out of trouble, and when that didn't work, to fight his way out. But the most important education of Gabaldon's young life came from an unlikely source. In his early teens, he was taken in by a Japanese-American family, the Nakanos, who became his foster parents. They treated him like their own son, and in their household, Guy learned something that would later save hundreds of lives. He learned Japanese. Not the formal textbook Japanese taught in classrooms. He learned street Japanese, the casual language of everyday conversation, insults, jokes, the way real people actually talked. He picked up the nuances, the tone, the psychology behind the words. He learned how to persuade, how to negotiate, how to connect. Years later, when the war came and Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent to internment camps, including his foster family, Guy was left alone. He was 16 years old. In 1943, at 17, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Marine Corps. He wanted to fight. But more than that, he wanted to prove something, that a Mexican-American kid from the streets could be a hero, that he belonged. The Marines sent him to the Pacific, and in June 1944, his unit, the 2nd Marine Division, landed on Saipan as part of the massive American offensive to crack Japan's outer defenses. The island was heavily fortified, and the Japanese garrison was ordered to fight to the last man. But Guy Gabaldon had other ideas. On his first night on Saipan, while other Marines dug foxholes and tried to get some rest, Gabaldon did something that would have gotten most soldiers court-martialed. He left his post. Without permission, without backup, without orders, he walked into enemy territory. He moved through the darkness, listening, watching. He knew the Japanese were hiding in caves, terrified but defiant. He found 2 guards outside a cave entrance and surprised them. Using his street Japanese, he told them in their own language that they were surrounded, that resistance was useless, that if they came with him, they'd be treated fairly. It worked. 2 prisoners. He brought them back to American lines. His commanding officers were furious. They threatened him with a court-martial for leaving his post. They told him never to do it again. The next night, Guy Gabaldon went out and did it again. This time he was more methodical. He approached a cave, shot the guards outside before they could react, then moved to the side of the entrance and shouted in Japanese, "You're surrounded and have no choice but to surrender. Come out and you'll be treated with respect. Stay inside and you will die." He waited. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, figures began to emerge. Hands raised, eyes wide with fear. Gabaldon collected them, treated them gently, spoke to them in their own language, and walked them back to American lines. His superiors didn't know what to make of him. This wasn't standard procedure. This wasn't how the Pacific War was fought. But they couldn't argue with results. More importantly, the prisoners Gabaldon brought back provided intelligence about Japanese positions, troop strengths, and defensive plans. So they let him continue, and Guy Gabaldon was just getting started. Over the following weeks, Gabaldon developed his method. Every night, sometimes completely alone, sometimes with 1 or 2 other Marines, he would venture into contested territory to hunt for caves and buildings where Japanese soldiers were hiding. His technique was psychological warfare at its finest. He would shoot guards quickly to prevent them from alerting others inside. Then he'd position himself to the side of the cave entrance, out of direct line of fire, and begin talking. Not shouting orders, but talking in Japanese. He'd tell them the truth, that American forces controlled the island, that the Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't coming back, that massive U.S. warships sat just offshore, ready to level every position. He'd appealed to their survival instinct, promising food for the hungry, medical treatment for the wounded, humane captivity instead of death. When talking didn't work fast enough, he'd improvise. He threatened to use flamethrowers he didn't actually have. He'd toss in smoke bombs, forcing people out, gasping and choking. Sometimes he'd hold one guard at gunpoint while ordering another to go inside and convince the others to just come out and talk. Just talk. No commitment, no surrender yet, just a conversation. And it worked because Guy Gabaldon understood something the military textbooks didn't. People want to live. Even soldiers trained in the Bushido Code, even civilians told by their emperor to commit suicide rather than be captured, they wanted to live. They just needed someone to give them permission, to make it okay, to show them another way. Gabaldon's Spanish also proved useful. Many of the islands in the Pacific, including Saipan, had been under Spanish colonial rule for centuries. The indigenous Chamorro people spoke Spanish, and Gabaldon could communicate with them too, gaining their trust and their help in locating Japanese positions. Night after night, Gabaldon brought in prisoners. 2 here, 5 there, a dozen from another cave. His fellow Marines started calling the planes he brought in Gabby's guests. He was building a reputation, and word was spreading, not just among Americans, but among the Japanese themselves. Then came the day that would define Guy Gabaldon's war and cement his place in military history. By early July, the main battle for Saipan was ending. Organized Japanese resistance was collapsing. But thousands of soldiers and civilians were still in the interior of the island, trapped and desperate. The Japanese commanding general, Yoshitsugu Saito, had already committed ritual suicide. Many combatants were throwing themselves off cliffs rather than surrender. Others were killing Japanese civilians, forcing them to jump, telling them that the Americans would torture and murder them. It was a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in real time. An estimated 22,000 non-combatants would die on Saipan, many by mass suicide encouraged or forced by the Japanese military. On July 8th, Gabaldon captured 2 enemy guards during a patrol. Using his now well-practiced technique, he convinced one of them to return to a nearby cave complex with an offer. "Come out and surrender, and you'll be treated well." The guard went back inside. Gabaldon waited. Minutes stretched into hours. He had no backup. If this went wrong, if they decided to fight, he'd be killed instantly. But he trusted his instincts. He'd been reading people his whole life. Then a Japanese officer emerged. Not a soldier, not a frightened civilian, but an officer, a man with authority. Gabaldon spoke to him directly, calmly, in Japanese. He explained the situation. The war on Saipan was lost. Continuing to fight meant death for everyone. Surrender meant life, safety, food, medical care. He pointed to the massive American warships visible off the coast. He didn't threaten. He just presented reality. The officer listened. Then he nodded. What happened next defied belief. Over the next several hours, more than 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians emerged from the caves. They came in waves, wounded and healthy, military and civilian, all choosing life over death. One 18-year-old Marine with a rifle and rudimentary Japanese had convinced an entire enemy force to surrender. Gabaldon turned them over to U.S. military authorities. He grabbed a K ration, devoured it, lay down on a blanket, and passed out. When he woke up, he'd become a legend. They started calling him the Pied Piper of Saipan. Guy Gabaldon's commanding officer, Captain John Schwab, immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Schwab noted that Gabaldon had single-handedly captured more than 10 times the number of prisoners taken by legendary World War I hero Sergeant Alvin York, who had received the Medal of Honor for capturing 132 German soldiers. By the end of the campaign on Saipan and Tinian, Gabaldon was credited with capturing or persuading to surrender approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians, the highest number ever achieved by a single individual in U.S. military history. But Guy Gabaldon didn't receive the Medal of Honor. Instead, he was awarded the Silver Star. Some historians believe the decision was influenced by racial prejudice. In 1944, a Mexican-American kid from East LA didn't fit the image of an American war hero. The Medal of Honor typically went to officers or soldiers from more privileged backgrounds. Gabaldon himself never complained publicly, but those who knew him said the slight hurt. He'd risked his life, night after night, walking alone into enemy territory, saving countless American lives by removing enemies from the battlefield without firing a shot, and preventing mass civilian casualties through his compassion and linguistic skill. In 1960, 16 years after the battle, the Marine Corps upgraded his Silver Star to the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. It was a recognition, but not the full recognition many believed he deserved. A friend with Hollywood connections helped get his story told in the 1960 film Held to Eternity. But even then, Guy Gabaldon's ethnicity caused problems. The studio cast a white actor, Jeffrey Hunter, in the lead role. Not everyone accepted Gabaldon's version of events without question. Lieutenant Robert Sheeks, a Marine Japanese language officer who also served on Saipan, later expressed skepticism about some of Gabaldon's claims. Sheeks called Gabaldon a relentless self-promoter and suggested he exaggerated the numbers, arguing that many of those who surrendered were civilians rather than soldiers. There were also darker allegations. Sheeks relayed claims that Gabaldon once struck an elderly Japanese civilian, breaking his jaw when the man didn't answer quickly enough. These accounts remain uncorroborated by official records, but they raised questions about Gabaldon's methods and character. What is undeniable, however, is that Gabaldon's actions were officially recognized by the U.S. military. His commanding officers who witnessed his work firsthand recommended him for the highest honors. The Navy Cross he eventually received is an official validation that his achievements were real and significant. Historians note that memories of wartime events, especially decades later, can be colored by personal bias and must be evaluated critically. In August 1944, while fighting Japanese guerrillas still hiding on Saipan, Gabaldon was seriously wounded in an enemy machine gun ambush. The injuries ended his combat career. He received an honorable discharge from the Marine Corps and returned to civilian life. After the war, he moved to Mexico and ventured into various businesses: a furniture store, fishing, import-export of Mexican goods. He married, raised a family, and tried to build a normal life. But the war never really left him. How could it? He'd walked into caves night after night, faced death repeatedly, and talked hundreds of people out of killing themselves and others. Guy Gabaldon died on August 31, 2006, at the age of 80. He was buried with military honors, his Navy Cross prominently displayed. Veterans who served with him remembered him as brave, perhaps reckless, but undeniably effective. The debate about exact numbers and methods continues among historians, but his basic achievement stands unchallenged. He captured more enemy combatants single-handedly than any other American soldier in history. Guy Gabaldon's story raises profound questions about heroism, recognition, and who gets to be remembered. His achievement was extraordinary by any measure. He prevented countless deaths on both sides. He demonstrated that even in the brutal Pacific War, where mercy was rare and racial hatred intense, human connection was possible. Yet because of his ethnicity and his methods, which didn't fit the conventional image of military heroism, full recognition eluded him for most of his life. There were no dramatic charges into enemy fire, no last stands, no inspirational speeches. Just a street-smart kid from East LA who understood that the most powerful weapon in war isn't always a gun. Sometimes it's language, empathy, and the courage to walk alone into enemy territory armed with nothing but words. The caves on Saipan still stand today, silent witnesses to one of the war's most unusual stories. If you visit the island, you can see the cliffs where thousands jumped to their deaths, and you can walk the ground where Guy Gabaldon once stood, calling out in Japanese to people who'd been taught to hate him, offering them life instead of death. Most of them took his offer, and because they did, hundreds of families on both sides of the Pacific were spared the grief of losing loved ones in those caves. That's the measure of Guy Gabaldon. not in the medals he received or didn't receive, but in the lives he saved. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians who survived the war because one teenager refused to accept that mass death was inevitable. Hundreds of American Marines who didn't have to fight cave-by-cave battles that would have killed many of them. In the end, perhaps that's the truest form of heroism. Not destroying the enemy, but finding a way to let them live. Not all heroes charge forward with guns blazing. Some walk alone into the darkness and talk. And sometimes, against all odds, people listen.